Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Aththa Daily. My name is Shiran Ilanperuma. I'm a researcher at the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. And today I'm very happy to have with me dear friend and comrade, Samath Gambampilla from the Democratic Left Front. Welcome, Samath.
Cheers, Shiran. Thanks so much for having me. It's an absolute honor to be here on the Aththa Daily show, celebrating Fidel Castro's 100th birthday. I mean, how good can this be? Thanks so much for having me.
Great to have you, and absolutely, you beat me to the cut, basically. We're here to celebrate Fidel, the centenary of Fidel, right? So August 3rd is going to be 100 years since the birth of Fidel Castro. It's really hard to capture in a few words the stature of someone like Fidel, right? He's like a revolutionary, a guerrilla, a statesman, a theorist, lawyer, yeah, Marxist intellectual, so many things, but also a very polarizing figure, right? We know that there's an immense pressure campaign against the Cuban people, led by the United States right now. Cuba is described as a state sponsor of terrorism, an autocracy, all these sorts of crazy things. But I mean, before we get into any of that, I'm curious what you think of Fidel. I mean, someone coming from the left tradition, but also someone of a same generation as me, like a millennial, right?
Sure.
We didn't come into left politics at the time of the Cuban Revolution.
No.
That was a long time ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
But what does Fidel mean to you now in the present?
I mean, it's interesting, right? So what Fidel has kind of done is he's created a movement, not just in Cuba, but across the world, just through what he believed in and through his actions. So to me, Fidel is honestly the poster child, the person, the kind of front facer of what today's modern man and woman should sort of adhere to, or like uphold and kind of aspire towards, purely because of the way he's led his government and his people. It's through a conviction that the masses can prevail, and the way the masses can be emancipated is through social programs which empowers them at a very local level, while also changing changing industries and changing policy, but at a societal level, the changes which he brought for the Cuban people has been immense. And that's really what kind of really inspires me, is that at that social level, how he managed to bring in a sense of joy and happiness and kind of harmony within society. I think that's just pure magic, which we have not seen from any other form of governance, really. Especially, I mean, if we're comparing it with the West, people in the West kind of congregate and kind of gather together over McDonald's, maybe, but that gives you obesity and alcoholism and in general, a bad diet. But those are their kind of that's what the West usually has, is consumption. Whereas, sure, in Cuba, you still got cohibas and rum and all of that stuff, but you've got music, you've got political debate, you've got the arts, all being promoted by the state, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, and also in conditions of, immense siege, basically, right? I mean, Cuba, I think, probably one of the longest running examples of an economic siege, right? It's basically an act of war, the denial of fuel for the past couple of years, medicines, third-party sanctions, so nobody can trade with Cuba even if they want to, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, take the example of Sri Lanka. Like, if the Cuban ambassador walked into the state-owned Bank of Ceylon tomorrow and wanted to open an account, right, and to deposit some money in that, she wouldn't be able to. Why? Because the global financial system is controlled by the United States, which tries to suffocate Cuba so much.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting if you think about it, because on the one hand, the US is like the most powerful country in the world, militarily, right? Economically, it still has all this control of the financial system. You could see why rationally it would have perceived the Soviet Union as a threat. You could have seen why rationally it perceives the rise of China as a threat, right, to its economic competitiveness. But little old Cuba, it's a very small island. I think the population is probably like half of Sri Lanka, around that much.
Exactly. Right? Yeah.
I mean, why Cuba is a question I think not many people answer. Like, Why do you think they're so hell-bent on crushing that little island?
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. I think it's that American term, let the haters hate. They've taken it literally. And they see the Cuban Revolution as something which they just can't get their heads around, because I feel that because it's so close to American shores that they're so afraid that this concept of real social mobility and social kind of, upliftment, which is possible in Cuba, will end up being sort of exported to the United States and cripple their whole top-down economic structure, which is entirely top-down. I mean, the income disparity in the States is absurd.
One of the worst in the world, yeah.
One of the worst in the world. They've got a huge fentanyl, crack cocaine, homeless, huge problem. In the richest cities, in San Francisco, you've got zombies walking around. There's income disparity across, like, it's so huge, the income disparity. Whereas in Cuba, you've got the best healthcare system in the world. In spite of being under siege since 1959, you've got the best education, one of the best education systems in the world, which churns out these doctors and engineers and people who actually go and help communities, not just in Cuba, but across the world. America does it, yes, but it's at a price. I mean, even USA, it comes at a price, right?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah,
I think that really calls into question also all these debates we have, which in my opinion are very narrow about what constitutes a democracy or not a democracy. I mean, the US likes to, or at least used to, promote itself as the sort of beacon of freedom and liberty and individual whatnot. But you see the US system today with all the wealth and abundance, and it cannot deliver basic necessities to people. Whereas you look at Cuba, which in conditions of siege at a very lower level of development and industrialization produces quite a lot for its people, to be frank, right? Despite everything. I mean, at the Tricontinental Institute, we've been doing a study which is not published yet.
Okay.
But I was editing it recently, so I'm going to sneak a few details from it. So we did a study that we know in economics, there is a near perfect correlation between GDP per capita and life expectancy. So the higher your GDP per capita, the higher life expectancy is going to be. And there's a trend line, if you know your statistics. And obviously countries fall above or below the trend line.
Sure.
Right? So Cuba is a very interesting example because it is one of the highest above the trend line.
Right. Yeah.
That means it has a better health or life expectancy outcome than you would expect for its income level.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Cuba is one of the few countries that's like that. The others are like China and Vietnam.
Right.
Yeah. So interesting. 3 countries with a socialist background.
Yeah. Very interesting.
And then you have Sri Lanka, Costa Rica, which are like social democratic kind of third world countries. Right. The US performs below the trend line.
Right.
It's one of the worst performers on life expectancy. It's actually going down in the richest country in the world for all the reasons you just said. The fentanyl crisis, the extremely bad healthcare, right? And I think, like you said, it's just the example of Cuba that even with less wealth but better social organization, that you can deliver a better life for people.
Yeah.
I think that example is so threatening to the West, and even to some extent to certain elites in the global South, in the rest of the world.
Yeah, because it comes down to one, state planning to an extent.
Absolutely.
But also regulation, right?
Yeah.
I think it goes against the fundamentals of the US economy, which is deregulate, feed people all the stuff which is going to kill you, and then sell them medicine which is going to keep you running until you end up, altering your persona, because the medicine kind of it will either send you into, you're either on antidepressants or you're on anti-obesity pills. Now you've got Ozempic and all of this stuff to make you thin again, shrink your stomach. Whereas I think in places like Cuba, where the government is more focused on a holistic approach to how you should live. Yes, you should have a good time. You should be able to drink, eat sugar, but there's still a lot around you to make sure that you stay well. I mean, it's interesting. Cuba is one of the first countries in the world to develop some sort of therapy, or even, I would like to say, a cure, but at the very least, a very good therapy for throat cancer. Because they were all smoking cohibas. And guess what? The medical industry found a solution to actually, treat throat cancer. We don't really speak about the medical breakthroughs which come from this country, this tiny little country, like you said, 11 million. I think now it's dropped down slightly to maybe under 10 million people, creating an R&D medical system which is putting out, dengue vaccines,
Yep.
COVID vaccines. They had their own therapeutic COVID vaccine, which didn't have the ill effects of, what we all know, what was Pfizer and AstraZeneca and all of this stuff. So it really serves the needs of their people, which is, extremely commendable. And it goes back to who is this man, Fidel Castro, and how did he manage to do this with, 19 or 22 people on board a boat, right? Unbelievable.
Yeah, I think, the appeal of Fidel, at least for our generation of people in the left movement or the socialist movement, is one as a figure of emulation, right? Because he is a sort of the archetypical new man sort of person, right? The person who was sort of striving to better himself, but more importantly to better society, who was sort of organically embedded in mass movements, was able to articulate their demands and engage in all sorts of levels, right? So from the grassroots, in guerrilla warfare, military tactics, to him speaking for like 3-4 hours at
court,
in court or in the United Nations, right? So he is this figure that I think people aspire to be to. But at the same time, it's interesting. I've never been to Cuba, but from what I've heard from people who've been to Cuba is that you actually don't see many pictures of him.
Right.
Like there is no real state-sponsored cult of personality as such about Fidel. Of course, recently, because it's the centenary of Fidel, I think the Cuban party has had a colloquium. They invited foreign delegates and they all spoke about Fidel's legacy and such. But it's not like you go everywhere on the streets and you see pictures of Fidel. It's not like government offices are covered in pictures of Fidel, right? There's no sort of cult of personality around him. What exists is almost purely voluntary, right? A kind of social recognition of his significance.
Yeah.
Which I find very interesting.
Absolutely. I think they let the sort of record speak for itself. I think he said it himself, but history will absolve me. Exactly. And that's really what they've managed to hone in on as a society. Sure, as a government, but as a society, they really live the brand. Socialism is their brand, and they've done their best with it. It's interesting to see also what he's done across the world, right? It was not confined to this little island in Cuba. They were a huge part of the liberation movement in South Africa. Mandela gives Fidel Castro immense credit for emancipating South Africa, Zimbabwe, Angola. I think there was a medical emergency in Armenia in the 80s, I believe, where there was a huge blood shortage. I don't know what, I can't remember. Do you remember what the catastrophe was in Armenia?
Not particular about Armenia, but I know, Pakistan after the earthquake, Sri Lanka after the tsunami, wherever there's a disaster in the third world, quite quickly after you will find Cuban doctors somewhere there on the scene, right?
Yeah.
So, this is the export of their revolution, but it's internationalism and it's a people's internationalism.
Yeah.
Right? They're not here like the US aid would be to get you hooked onto US wheat manufacturers or to sort of create market share for particular pharmaceutical companies.
Exactly.
They're here to solve a problem because they're people oriented.
Exactly.
Right? They're solution oriented.
Exactly.
They're not profit or market oriented where every crisis is an opportunity to just create another market.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. There's no catch.
There's no catch.
No.
There's no catch except the fact that there's a recognition that freedom for one is sort of contingent on freedom for all.
Absolutely.
Yeah? But I'm very glad you brought up that point about looking at his legacy in terms of the global South, right? Especially in the current scenario, we know that every year in the UN there is a vote about the embargo on Cuba, and it's an overwhelming majority that vote in favor of Cuba. Right? It's usually only the US and surprise Israel. Big surprise that vote against.
Yeah.
So we know that there's this huge amount of let's say support or validation of Cuba, what it stands for, what it represents, right? Even from conservative governments.
Yeah, absolutely.
What else do you think are the elements of this kind of legacy in the global South? Because it almost seems that despite Cuba being crushed economically, it still seems as if a lot of countries haven't reached Cuba's level of development in a political sense. right? Even though economically some of us may have advanced because we have, we're not being crushed
Yeah.
by an embargo, but politically it feels like we haven't reached whatever the Cubans have achieved. Yeah.
I would say it's really, I totally agree. I mean, I think the shortfall with many of the governments, especially say in the global south, is that we're still too reliant. So we've all got a few strings still attached to the global sort of order, whereas Cuba's was cut off. Hey, who knows what would have happened to Cuba if the US chose to deal with Fidel Castro differently? We'd never know, right? I'd like to think that it would have been the same, and it would have been business as usual, possibly even better. But you never know. I think Cuba's story almost comes out of that need to survive, to overcome the struggle, really. And that because of kind of what the position they were put into, that you somehow manage to overcome the problems which are sort of thrown at you. Here in the global, in Sri Lanka, for example, we take a lot of, the sound bites and all the bits from Cuba in many a sense, and from the Cuban Revolution. But I feel like because we're in the kind of market conditions and government conditions which we are in, we can't always push through with something as revolutionary as what Fidel Castro was proposing for Cuba, because we're always trying to, like in Sri Lanka, what they say, we're trying to balance. We're trying to balance everything. We're trying to balance the business community, the farming community, the conservative religious right of the country. We're trying to balance everyone in these countries, right? I think that's sort of the negative of democracy in many ways. I mean, Cuba was not. You wouldn't call Cuba a democracy, right?
Not a liberal sort of
not
parliamentary democracy.
Exactly.
It breeds that kind of oppositional politics.
Precisely. So I think that sort of gives way to us being stuck in this position of what are we really? We're the Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka, but which part of that actually goes into social programs,
right,
and emancipates the people through social programs. There's only so much Samurdhi is gonna do for people, right? So I think that's really a problem with our approach to emanating the true Cuban essence of society and governance. We kind of lose our way somewhere between trying to make sure that everyone is happy.
So Cuba is very popular in Sri Lanka in particular, right? I mean, you see the image of Che Guevara anywhere you go in Sri Lanka, on tuk-tuks, on the street, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I'm not sure, aside from the iconography, how much we've actually taken from Cuba and Fidel and Che and so on. Especially you look at the state of the Sri Lankan economy right now.
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because you've got so much symbolism, especially around Che, you would say. I mean, the two you see the most, like in terms of, rebellious kind of left-wing ideologies, Che and Bob Marley, right? So you see Che Guevara on tuk-tuks, Che Guevara wants you to rebel. You've got imprints of Che on walls where it says no to the IMF with a picture of Che on the wall. A lot of the student movements use Che's, face as symbolism for what they stand for. I just wonder how much of this converts to action on the ground from the left. In terms of the left, how much do we actually, kind of practice what we preach in many ways? And what does this actually mean for society? I think I see it as a real plus that we do have that symbolism. I'm glad that it's still popular and it's not been wiped out. Sure, the buildings have come up. Societies are being evicted or kind of moved out of their traditional neighborhoods, especially in urban areas like Colombo. And there's absolutely no planning when it comes to, building anything in this country. But the fact that there's this symbolism around Che is, it's heartening. I'm really glad that it's there, because I think that means that there is potential, or there is a spark. We just need to make sure that we, light that fire and make something out of it. I think everyone everyone's a rebel in waiting at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. They're just, I think, probably too atomized by neoliberal society, by the informal economy, by sort of
TikTok revolution.
TikTok, social media, consumerism and all of that thing to actually come together, which is actually one of the downsides of having a very individualistic idea of revolution, right? Because behind Fidel, behind Che were the people. It was an immense
Absolutely.
social process that produced these figures.
Absolutely.
And they came to reflect that process. They were manifestations of the Cuban Revolution in a sense.
Yes.
Right? Not just leaders. But, I mean, speaking of sort of the environment, I mean, just pivoting to Sri Lanka and to Colombo in particular, yeah, you know, you see these little flashes of left-wing politics on the streets, right? On street art, on tuk-tuks and so on. But at the same time, the landscape of Colombo is totally changing, right?
Yeah.
You go down Marine Drive now, it's just more and more restaurants and, you know, spas, which we can sort of guess, you know, what those things
Who's
are.
behind them, yeah.
Who's behind them. You see more and more luxury hotels, move towards sort of casinos, very, you know, high-end consumption. And for who? For a very narrow elite, right?
Yeah.
You have this construction, the city of dreams.
Yeah.
And I always ask, whose dream is this, right?
Absolutely.
Who's this city for, really?
Yeah.
Certainly it's not the dream of the average working person. It's not the dream of the people who were living in Slave Island who were then pushed out
No.
by urban development, right?
Absolutely.
So-called urban development. There's clearly a case where there's a huge gap between, I think, what the average sort of moral political compass of the Sri Lankan is and the direction of sort of neoliberal restructuring of the economy. And, you know, in that sense, how do we sort of make this more than an ideal, right? Because I think even I come across older people, even in the left movement, who might be disenchanted with everything that has happened since the fall of the Soviet Union. And, you know, God forbid, if something happens to Cuba, that's going to be another blow, right?
Yeah.
If Cuba collapses or something like that, which I don't believe it will. But just the fact that Cuba is on the edge right now creates a lot of disenchantment.
Absolutely.
This is no longer valid. You know, it doesn't work. You know, we have to. There is no alternative, so to speak.
Yeah.
How do you respond to that kind of thinking?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that right now, given what a precarious and sensitive place Cuba is in right now, the short answer is they've survived for 60 years. You know, lights have been turned off many a time over the last 60 years, but they persevere. They still prevail, and they figure it out because that's just their culture. You know, they've been ingrained over the last 60 years. While the lights have been turned on and off, they've been educated. They've been planning. You know, they've got real social. They've got a social mechanism in that country, which works towards the betterment of each other. And I think, like you said, because there's less of a polarizing effect within society and between the individual and society, they are able to work together to find solutions. So maybe you might not have a few essentials to survive for the week, but then someone down the road might be able to help you out. And more. I think in 1989, when the Soviet Union collapsed, they went through this period of what they call, peak oil moment, where they just didn't have their biggest trading partner collapsed overnight. They did not have access to, I think, petroleum oil and everything you needed to keep the machines going. And there was a potential food shortage, I believe, at the time. And Castro obviously was at the head of the state. They began growing fruit and vegetable wherever, on any green patch. They began growing, and it was a national movement to just grow, and guess what? They didn't face malnutrition. They managed to avoid going into this sort of situation where they were facing starvation, and it did impact their lives, of course. It's not easy to not live without petroleum, especially back then when all your machines were running on it. But they managed. And it's 2026 now. They're still here. So they have managed. If, for example, if us as Sri Lankans put that same effort, which they did into growing vegetables, into eradicating dengue, for example, we'd see huge results.
Yeah.
I mean, we'd eradicate dengue. They've eradicated dengue, by the way, in Cuba. There is no malaria. There is no dengue. It is a tropical country.
Yep.
It's in the tropics, right? And guess what? They've eradicated those problems. Those are problems left in us mixed economy, pro-IMF nations. It's funny, ever since the IMF has kicked in, dengue is increased. So what does that say about the state of affairs in this country? The high rises are coming up, the money is being loaned, but we can't seem to collect our garbage. Tourists are, all over the country, pouring in the south, or in Sigiriya, and we're selling our nation. I saw this thing. There's a jungle music festival being promoted in Sigiriya. I mean, it's kind of wild, that you'd want to have a kind of rave near Sigiriya, where there are elephants, and these are sensitive areas. But that's how far we're willing to push the boat out to gain this sort of commercial, for commercial interest. But there's no follow-up and there's no garbage management. So it's like, what are we, So I think Sri Lanka is in that situation where we don't really know what we are in terms of, sure, we need the processes to amass some sort of, to keep the economy going. But how do you manage this? And and to manage an economy, most of the times, guess what? The economy can't help you manage the economy. Or the market won't help you manage the market. You do need some regulation. You do need some sort of social services, which I think that's where the kind of miss is what I think.
Yeah, I think that's another great lesson from Fidel, also in the sense that it's politics comes first. I mean, every economic decision is a political decision.
Absolutely.
Right, because in economics, I mean, I studied economics myself, so it's a very cold language we use in economics, right? Externalities, winners and losers, right? But these are deeply, deeply political terms, which I think Fidel and the Cuban Revolution really understood. I mean, as we've established, with much fewer resources, they have much better social outcomes.
Yeah.
And the point you made also about the fact that the Cubans have been through this over and over again, and they've never really collapsed, also goes to show the different kind of society that they have built in Cuba, because it's not a highly individualistic or consumer society, right? Because in Sri Lanka, I mean, the Aragale of 2022, for example, right? Of course, it was unprecedented for so many people to come to the streets and protest against the government. But, I would say a good chunk of that was also the middle class just upset at their consumption patterns being disrupted.
Yeah.
So it was a rupture politically, but it didn't necessarily lead to a political transformation in consciousness. It didn't necessarily make people more collectively oriented, under a common sort of national social program, anything like that, right? But the Cubans have been through that process.
Absolutely.
Right?
Exactly.
So when they're suffering, they know they're all suffering together.
Yeah.
When we're suffering in Sri Lanka, we know that's not the case.
It's poor me.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right? Because we know there's always someone on the street with a better car, with better clothes. There's a deep level of inequality that's probably worsened since the 2022 crisis.
The Rolls Royces.
Yes. The Rolls Royces.
Rolls Royces.
Rolls Royces, yeah. Because of Dudley Sirisena. Yeah. So it's interesting. I mean, people point to the Cuban model and say it's a failure. But I mean, a failure for who? I mean, if you want to have a white-collar job, or if you want to have the monopoly on whatever essential commodity and be rich, of course you don't have the freedom to do that.
No.
In Cuba.
Absolutely.
Cuba is very authoritarian. And very oppressive if you are someone who wants to have a mansion and multiple cars and so on.
Exactly.
But it's very democratic and very progressive if you're someone who needs to have food on the table, to educate your children, to get a job, and so on and so forth.
And I think even though Cuba is sort of, you could say, repressive in terms of amassing wealth, it's important to kind of highlight that the Cuban government did not appropriate everyone's land and wealth. I mean, they've taken over certain parts of people's industries, but they didn't evict people from their houses. You still get
most Cubans own their house.
Most Cubans own their house, own their own house under this regime, through the revolution.
Of course.
So which is amazing. Whereas here, it's a free market. You can own a mansion. There are people building multi-story, Ambani-esque sort of grotesque high-rise mansion things. But then you've also got slums, right? I mean, look at Bombay, or look at our country. Look at Vanathamulla versus Kolpiti or Cinnamon Gardens. The income disparity is obscene. The standards are just not there. So I think It's interesting. Yeah, no, you can't be the richest person in Cuba. They don't promote being rich or richer than your neighbor. But everyone is equally fine, and I think their richness is time. I think if you look at at least how I look at wealth is your return on time invested in anything. And if you've got time on your hands, you're probably rich. I think all rich people really want time.
Yeah.
Everyone wants time, free time, right? Your own time. But then I guess when you're chasing the dollar, it's a full-time job.
Yeah. Actually, at this point, I want to pivot to something else, because we talked about a lot about Cuba's domestic policies and sort of, Fidel's significance there.
Yeah.
One other thing that I think his legacy is still so important is the absolutely pivotal role he played in the non-aligned movement, the Third World Movement.
Yes.
And especially after that movement basically starts to falter and collapse, in the 1990s and so on and so forth, right? Because all of our countries, and Sri Lanka was one of the first, that surrendered to neoliberal policy, right? I mean, consider the fact that, we move away from the plantation economy in 1956.
Yep.
1970, you have the United Front government, a Republican constitution, nationalization. 1976, that's 50 years ago, we have the non-aligned movement conference in Sri Lanka, right? That's like peak, Sirimao, Third World, foreign policy, Sri Lankan social democracy.
Yes.
Literally 1 year later, they lose the election.
Yeah.
Government changes, and we are the first in Asia, South Asia, to start liberalizing.
Yeah.
Right? The Cubans didn't surrender so easily.
No.
Even during the special period which you mentioned of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the oil crisis, they never surrendered. And in fact, in the UN, Fidel was constantly talking about South-South cooperation and the Third World sort of working together as a unit at a time when no one else was talking about it.
Absolutely true.
Yeah. So he sort of kept the torch alight for that. And in a sense, again, he has been redeemed because that is somewhat on the table again, right? With the BRICS process, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, all these sort of tentative regional movements, right? These multilateral movements in the global south.
Yeah.
But again, Sri Lanka is somewhat nowhere to be seen in these things.
No. I think it comes down to us being, I think it's the legacy of 77 onwards, really. What happened to us post 77 was this creation of, a whole new kind of economic setup where the government subsidizes corporates, really. And we've just got into this thing where the government subsidizes corporates export to the West. So we essentially subsidize the West, right? And we've got addicted to it. We can't think of any alternative at the moment. We still haven't come up with real alternatives to, energy independence or any sort of independence. We're so reliant on, to the point where we send our people, our citizens of the country out to, far-flung parts of the Middle East to work at
Israel.
And Israel, a terrorist genocidal state, where we're publicly promoting and encouraging our people to go and work there and earn some shekels, because that's how bad our private sector performs in Sri Lanka, actually. It's a reflection of our private sector. I mean, we talk a big talk about how much we need to protect our private sector and the economy and, that they're drivers. But then if we actually rely on these poor people to go and earn a living,
Our biggest export is labor.
Yeah, at the risk of losing their life.
Yeah.
What does that say about our system?
I think it's a deficit of ideas, right? So even when, since the 2008 financial crisis and, the rise of China and, Russia-Ukraine war and sort of Iran holding its ground against U.S. assault.
Yeah.
It's clear there has been some kind of shift. There's a churn happening geopolitically. There is some scope to push back, but it's not the lack of opportunity that holds us back, I think. At this point, it's the sort of lack of ideas.
Absolutely.
Which brings me to my favorite concept from Fidel, which is the battle of ideas.
Right.
Which is exactly what he comes up with in the 1990s, because he knows the entire global progressive left socialist movement is on the back foot.
Yeah.
Right? You can no longer... you no longer have command over social movements like trade unions and so on, because those are all crushed in the 70s and 80s, often violently. And, the scope for sort of armed struggle, the way, Fidel and Che did, even at that time was limited. It was
Yeah.
actually, if you think about it, just a few countries that successfully did it.
Yeah.
Vietnam, Cuba successfully converted an armed national liberation struggle into a socialist revolution.
Yes.
But it's, and a few movements around the world tried to copy that, and many failed.
Yeah.
Like that's a fact,
Yes.
unfortunately.
Yeah.
Right? So I think Fidel was very attuned to the idea of ideals,
Yeah.
also maybe emotions, to maintain that sense of revolutionary optimism, positivity, and also to always contest, because, when you live under neoliberal capitalism, there's a constant onslaught of ideas which you may not be able to recognize them at first, right? But there's a certain pattern of thinking that's imposed upon you.
Yes.
And the left in a lot of places has failed, I think, to actively push back,
Yeah.
to create intellectual production,
Yeah.
at every level, to sort of push back on that and keep articulating the fact that alternatives are possible. That these are all political decisions, not sort of a one track, there is no alternative.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. I think a lot of the time, what we forget about the sort of what the alternative looks like is based on what society looks like, right? So I think if society can't see an alternative to consumer capitalism, then that, and if you're only looking at a sort of socialist or left-wing approach to the economy without looking at society's problems, you're not going to get the solution you're looking for. I think this is what Castro and Cuba really did really well was they created a thriving society, not a basic society, a thriving society which is heavy on the arts, music, merriment. I think is a huge part of it. Being experiencing joy, vacations, which I would say today also is the anniversary of our Hartal. The 1953 Hartal is it today?
I think it was a few days ago, maybe.
It was a few days ago.
It's around this time. Interesting. It times perfectly well with Fidel's birthday,
right?
Around the same week.
Correct. And I mean, that was our left-wing struggle, right? That was our moment, which actually pushed the left-wing forces into prominence and pushed the people's struggle into prominence, and where we actually gained a lot of ground, more ground than we've ever gained on behalf of the masses of Sri Lanka at that point during that period. So I think that's really important. Right now, what we see is we've got governments which are focused a lot on the kind of the current trends, the current market, where they've kind of lost track of they can't see an alternative. They don't seem to see what the alternative looks like. And I think Fidel's battle of ideas comes into prominence at this moment, where it's like, what is the alternative in a kind of post-capitalist world where the trillionaires and the crypto bros are earning, hand over fist way more than the average high-performing lawyer even. Even the best lawyers are like outperformed in the trillions by a few people. That's when the real battle of ideas begins, because I think people who thought that they were in the sort of upper, bourgeois or petit bourgeois, they're actually close to the working class at this point in terms of their financial capital. And I think that's when hopefully the switch would turn on, the light would turn on, and people start sort of reassessing what their lives actually made of. I mean, are you meant to be cruising in a car from one point to the other at the risk of being mobbed? Is that what life is? Or would you rather live in a society where everyone's, no one's destitute and you can walk the streets safe? So I think that's sort of where we're at.
That's, I think, a very powerful image to end this conversation with, because we're short of time. But thanks so much, Samath, for joining me. And thank you to our viewers watching another episode of Aththa Daily. See you next time.
Cheers. Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate
Thanks,
it. Thank you.